What if you could threaten your opponent's king in just 2 moves? That's the power of the bishop's opening. Today, I am extremely pleased to share with you a new opening line, the bishop's opening. It begins after the first moves pawn to e4, pawn to e5, and then bishop to c4. This is not the mainstream choice. It is far less popular compared to the more common moves knight to f3 or knight to c3, as in the Vienna game. Nevertheless, bishop to c4 is perfectly sound. You are developing a piece while also aiming directly at black's weakest square, f7. From there, you can quickly launch an attack on your opponent's king. In addition, by playing bishop to c4, you often pull your opponent out of their prepared opening knowledge, allowing you to surprise them. Finally, there are many fascinating and aggressive attacking lines that you can follow up with in the bishop's opening. We'll go through the main continuations for black, starting with the move bishop to c5. If black isn't sure how to respond and mirrors your move with their own bishop, you have a surprising reply. Pawn to d4. This immediately fights for the initiative. What's the idea behind this pawn sacrifice? Well, if black accepts it with pawn takes d4, which is actually a mistake that's not easy to spot, you have a brilliant sacrifice. Bishop takes h7 check. After black captures with the king, you play queen to h5, attacking the bishop. Once the king retreats, you recapture the bishop. This sequence leaves black's king exposed and vulnerable to future attacks, while your position remains active. Meanwhile, the pawn on d4 is still under pressure. If black plays knight to c6, you can continue with knight to f3, hitting the pawn again. Should they defend with pawn to d6, you have options. For instance, a queen to c4 is likely the strongest, but queen to d5 is also very dangerous. This position can get tricky for black because if black plays bishop to a6 to shield the king, you respond with knight to g5, delivering a double attack on the opponent's king and bishop, and you are simply winning on the spot. Of course, black does not have to blunder that badly, but even so, their position is already compromised in this line. It is simply an incorrect way for black to play. Let's return to the bishop's opening. After we have just analyzed the move bishop to c5, we play pawn to d4, attacking both the bishop and the pawn. We already examined the line pawn takes d4, which turns out to be a mistake for black. Now let's look at the best response. Bishop takes d4. You continue with knight to f3, attacking the bishop. Black defends by playing knight to c6, and here you castle. Why not capture the bishop immediately? Because you are waiting for the perfect moment. At this stage, you have 2 potential ideas. One is to capture the bishop, and the other is to jump with the knight to g5, where, supported by your bishop, you attack the f7 square. You are simply holding both threats and waiting for the right time to strike. If black plays knight to f6, which is probably the best move and the main continuation, this is the ideal moment to capture the bishop. If black recaptures with the pawn, you can push your pawn forward to attack the knight on f6, creating serious problems for black. As you can see, the bishop's opening is not easy for black to handle. There are numerous pitfalls, and just one inaccurate move can put them in trouble very quickly. Let's break down the idea. First of all, black cannot capture the pawn, because if they do, you simply play rook to a1, pinning the knight. On the next move, if black tries pawn to d6, you respond with pawn to f4, and you will win the knight on the following move. The knight cannot escape because the king is directly behind it, making the pin deadly. This is simply losing for black. So, let's step back a few moves. Since capturing the pawn fails, black must move the knight. Retreating to g8 is a very passive and unpleasant choice. If instead black plays knight to e4, you continue with queen to g4. Now you are winning again because you are attacking both the knight and the pawn on g7. From there, you can also threaten the rook and the pawn on f7, leaving black's position in shambles. Let's rewind once more to see if there is any way for black to survive here. Indeed, there is one correct defense. When you capture the bishop, black should recapture with the knight instead of the pawn. In that case, your attack is harder to unleash, but still possible. You can continue with pawn to f4, keeping up the pressure and remembering that you have already sacrificed a pawn for dynamic play. Therefore, you need to play more aggressively. And by doing so, you open up lines for both of your bishops as well as the diagonal for your rook. From here, you begin applying pressure to black's central structure, both the pawn and the knight. Black will need to defend, and once they do, you can further open the rook's file and play bishop to g5, pinning black's queen. At this point, it is already clear that you have strong initiative in return for the pawn you sacrificed. For example, if black castles, you can develop with knight to c3. Alternatively, you could play knight to d2, or even knight to a3, keeping the c3 square available for later to chase the knight away. The move knight to c3 is especially logical because it eyes the d5 square, increasing pressure on both d5 and the knight on f6. If black tries to develop with bishop to e6, covering that square, you have a powerful reply, knight to d5. At first, black may be satisfied, thinking they are ready to capture your knight. But when they do, you recapture with the pawn, and suddenly the attack shifts. Now the knight on d4 has no escape squares, and you are prepared to play pawn to c3 to trap it completely. The pawn on d5 perfectly controls all potential retreat squares, leaving black in a highly uncomfortable position. For example, if black plays queen to d6, possibly aiming to attack your bishop on c5 or simply stepping out of the pin, you can once again switch to another threat. Now is the perfect moment to capture on f6, doubling black's pawns and weakening their pawn structure. After that, you play bishop to d3, turning to the most direct plan of attacking black's king. The bishop now targets the h7 square, and your queen is ready to jump to h5 to deliver checkmate. Once again, black is in serious trouble, and in a practical game, it's extremely difficult for them to find the correct defensive moves. For instance, if black captures the pawn, which is a mistake, you respond with pawn to c3, driving the knight away. When the knight retreats, you have a devastating discovered attack. Bishop takes h7 check, followed by queen takes d5, winning the game outright. That wraps up the main ideas in the bishop's opening after bishop to c5. We've covered the most natural continuations for black in this line. Now, let's examine another common response, knight to c6. In this case, you also have something interesting, the move knight to c3. At this point, you deliberately delay the development of your knight from g1. You do not play knight to f3 right away because you want to keep the option of pushing your pawn to f4 first. This gives you a more aggressive setup and allows you to start expanding on the king side early in the game. For example, if black plays something like knight to f6, you respond with pawn to d3, once again holding back the knight's development and waiting for the right moment. If the opportunity arises, you push the pawn forward. Let's say black plays pawn to d6 or another quiet move. Now you strike with pawn to f4. Only after that do you play knight to f3, completing your development. Thanks to the pawn on f4, your setup is much more aggressive. It activates your rook along the f-file and also gives you the option of pushing pawn to f5 to gain more space and increase pressure on the king side. You can also choose to exchange pawns on e5, opening more lines for your pieces and launching an attack on the opponent's king. Overall, you have quite a promising position. For example, if black plays bishop to g4 to pin your knight, you can immediately drive it away with pawn to h3. This is no problem for you. The bishop cannot retreat safely, and thanks to your pawn on f4, you can push pawn to g4 and then capture the bishop with pawn support. Because of this, the pin is not a good option for black. If instead black captures your knight on f3, you simply recapture. Should they then play knight to d4, it is only a temporary nuisance. You retreat your piece for the moment, and after black makes their next move, you respond with bishop to e3, driving the knight away. Now you have the two bishops, a strong center, and pressure along both the diagonals and the f-file against black's queen. All in all, you hold a clear advantage here.